All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thanks for joining us for the Sustaining Barley Webinar Series, where we're hoping to serve as a forum for conversation and sharing of great ideas to advance sustainability in the malting barley industry. We hope you'll join us over the next several months as we bring forward innovative research and practices throughout the supply chain that's helping the malting, brewing, and distilling industries meet their sustainability goals. I want to thank my partners on this series, the Brewing and Malting Barley Research Institute. Gina's in the room today with us, helping manage the webinar, and also the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center. A big thank you to the members of our respective associations, including the American Malting Barley Association, who's making this content possible. So I just wanted to also show a little sneak peek of our November session. So I'm going to advance the slide here. If you have registered for the entire Sustaining Barley webinar series, you will have already or will receive a calendar invite from Zoom. You can also register by scanning the QR code on the screen right now. Each of our presenters today will speak for about 20 minutes, leaving 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So feel free to drop questions in the chat or come off mute at the end and join the conversation. And again, I and my partner here, Gina, we really want to encourage discussion during the series. So please feel free to engage in dialogue at the end today. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Nigel Davies, who's the director of Maltdoctor Ltd. It's a sustainability consultancy firm specializing in the food and beverage sectors. He's here to talk to us today about the potential for sustainable malt. Nigel has become well respected in this field, having designed the world's first malting barley carbon footprint calculator from farm to drink way back in 2004. So Nigel, thanks for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So you should be seeing the screen. Can I just check that, Ashley, before we start?
Looks great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm pleased to be able to talk to you about this subject. It's something that has meant a lot, as Ashley said. It's something that I've been engaged with for many years now, right from the point at which actually in 2004, people were really, it was carbon what, never mind what was sustainable. There's still a lot of debate around as to whether you can actually get good information that describes what sustainability is. And of course, sustainability now sort of morphed into this environmental social governance, which is not, as you sometimes hear, just a financial tool. It's far more than that. So hence the title, Fact or Fiction. You know, is this some story that you're making up just for the sake of the bankers? And for me, it never has been. It's always been something that helps you make better malt, make it more profitably, and perhaps even more importantly, understand the implications on your supply chain, particularly the farming side of it. And I always find it really interesting that you know, there's a Heineken phrase, no barley, no beer. So it kind of focuses the mind. So being sustainable in looking at your farming is really important. So that's where I'm coming from on this short presentation. So as we said, it's sustainability has really become environmental social governance, but there are so many ways to say the same thing that maybe it becomes a little confusing. So you've got this idea under soil health of protecting the terroir. You've got the idea of regenerative agriculture, organic farming, reduced inputs, improved yield, carbon sequestration, all of those things, biodiversity, natural capital. They're all talking about the same sort of things. And if you're not, I'm sure you're aware of that word terroir, but it's the soil characteristics that impact crop quality. So all of those things that we perhaps talk about separately, but they're all things now which people are trying to put a value on. So the idea with the new IFRS S1 and S2 legislation, which is legislation in some countries and is still sort of a code in other jurisdictions, they are trying to get us not only to look at the impact of all these things, but to put some financial value on, because they say if you put a financial value on, a company's more likely to do something about it or focus on it. And that's probably true. And then you've got the people characteristics around here, the social capital, health and safety, gender pay gaps. diversity, equity, and equality. And I've defined equity and equality there because this is a big challenge for our supply chain, that it's not just providing everybody with the same resources, because actually some people need a different set of resources to get to the same level of equality. So it's quite a challenge for businesses. The one we tend to focus on most are the operational side, of course, in the malting field. So we've been doing this for many years, and we've called it all sorts of things. If you're probably from Japan, you've called it Kaizen. If you're from Europe, you've probably called it lean manufacturing. And it's all about minimizing the inputs to your process. And latterly, we've now translated things like kilowatt hours into emissions, and we're now talking about efficiency in terms of carbon. But of course, then it's about the waste side of things. So all of these things, there's quite a number of things here which, if you look at them, you think, well, where do we start? Well, actually, I would say you don't need to start. You need to restart. And all these things will be in your businesses in some form or another, most likely. So it's a question of then translating those into the language of ESG so that you can talk in the same way across international boundaries about your progress. And share your risks and your opportunities. So what do you need to report? Well, the idea is that with the IFRS Foundation that's taken over from what was the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, they will give you a list of things which matter to our supply chain, a list of things which they say are material. And I don't think you'd really argue with that list. They have about 26 from which they distill down a few of them. And that materiality for our supply chain really comes out of two sectors, the food and beverage processing and agricultural products. And there's similarity, of course, between the two there. And if you look at those material areas for disclosure, everywhere there's a little green dot here, this is where we are required to do something, and maybe in the future report, or in some parts of the world, report now. So for example, if you're in Europe, they've got a different, they don't call it IFRS, but they call it CSRD, but it's very much the same, I would say. Maybe their legislators wouldn't agree, but I think there's very hard put to find a difference. But they've made that law. You have to report on these things and the financial impact. In the UK, where I am at the moment, that has been law for some companies, the biggest companies, for a couple of years now, and that's planned to roll out to most of the small or medium-sized enterprises by about 2027. And in Europe, they're expecting their small companies, about 75% of them, to be captured by next year. So it's really moving. So I'm going to focus in on, how do we get some of this information? And particularly, I'm going to focus in on carbon. But the idea, of course, is that, as we've said before, once you've made this list, you need to try and put a financial value on it. And this is where they get the idea of double materiality from. It's putting a financial risk number. Quite hard to do. For carbon, maybe it's a little easier, because if you're trading on a carbon market, which you might do in a slightly different way over in the States and in Canada, maybe you haven't got the legal registries that there are over in some parts of the world where carbon has a very distinct value. But you can use that, for example, and look at your emissions in terms of the value and decide how much it would cost you if you had to offset it, which you don't want to do, really. But you can use it as a potential offset, and that becomes a cost then to match against capital expenditure, if you like, to remove those emissions for good. So let's just focus on carbon footprint here, because it's key to our supply chain. It's something that I've been engaged with for a while. So if you're not familiar with it, then I'll just give you a little summary, and if you are, then bear with me. So for many years now, the carbon footprint has been determined by the amount of 7 gases now that go up into the atmosphere. And our processes generally will put up either carbon dioxide, methane, or nitrous oxide. The rest tend to be different industries. Now, each ton of those gases will hold different amounts of heat in the atmosphere, and we're trying to stop the heat capacity of the atmosphere holding so much of that it causes the planet to rise due to human activities, and we tip ourselves over the edge there. So this is where you get the carbon footprint from. If you put a ton of carbon dioxide, so not carbon, but carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that's a global warming potential of 1. If you put a ton of nitrous oxide, perhaps from fertilizer emissions, it holds 256 times more heat in the atmosphere, so its carbon footprint is 256. And you then work out for all the different parts of your supply chain, how many tons of those are put up into the atmosphere. And then you divide them up into 3 scopes. There's the things that you do directly, and you can see it could be the gas that you use, it could be transport that you run yourself and own yourself. The scope 2 is any electricity that you buy in, and scope 3 is everything else. It's all the things that come into your business and all the things that leave your business, the impact of that. And here's a few figures put on there as to where I have decided that these how these figures split up. Now, it's going to be interesting hearing Nathan speak later, because you'll see I've drawn a boundary on this. So this is not a life cycle analysis. This is saying start at the farm, finish at delivery to the brewery or distillery. Very different set of calculations if you're then trying to work out a full life cycle. So I think we'll be interesting to hear what Nathan says later on that. But if you do draw those boundaries, then this is roughly how it divides up. And you get an invoice for your gas use, you get an invoice for electricity use, so you're 100% confident of that 30%. If you look at the scope 3 that's coming into your facility, you can get some pretty good models of the carbon footprint for cereals. And you're going to be, sort of 80% is my figure. It'd be interesting to see what some of you think about that. But I think you're about 80% confident using the best tools that are available for malting barley. So you're about 80% certain of your scope 3 cereals. The rest, though, is quite tricky to get at. But you do have to be careful when you're looking at a long chain that you don't double count. So if you look at the greenhouse gas protocol, it says when things leave your business, you're supposed to account for the impact they have in another business down the line. But then, of course, they're also going to show in their carbon footprint the impact of the malt that you've given them. So a lot of the legal firms now are saying, look, come on, guys, don't do that. Try and draw the line as to where your direct responsibility lies. Don't ignore the impact of your product. And it depends, if you're an ingredient like malt, it's less important to think about that than if you're selling a product like a car or something like that, where you are directly responsible for what happens when somebody buys that product. So again, you're trying to get all of these figures ultimately. We're all trying to get them down to zero. That's the net zero impact. So, when we look at it, here's some typical figures in here, again, showing that in a slightly different way. But the interesting point here is not so much the one on the left, which we've already shown you in the previous slide, but on the right there, where do these scope 3 figures come from? And that's just an example. It would be different for every supply chain, and it would be different for each of you on the call today, but it'll give you an idea roughly of where some of the big ticket items are. Now, we've got that information by a combination of real data and also using predictions based on spend. Now, you might think that sounds ludicrous, but actually it's not too bad. If you've got no other way of getting into your supply chain carbon footprint, then there are models around that estimate, and bear in mind, it is only an estimate, it's only a midpoint value, but they'll give you a ballpark figure based on how much is actually spent as to how much those emissions are in your supply chain. All it does, it will give you your top 3 or 4 contributors, and you then go back to that part of the supply chain to get real data. So spend-based is not the end of the line, it's just a start and helps you get an idea of how much each part of your chain is contributing. And then if you look at the actual carbon footprint of barley, you can split that up even further, because that's the majority of it. The barley is the majority of the footprint coming in. A lot of that's associated with the production and use of nitrogen fertilizers, but the manufacturers of fertilizers are doing wonderful work on reducing those emissions. They've already taken, many years back now, they took 40% of the emissions out. And they're now working on not making it with fossil fuels, and making it by a completely new process, which means that they are much less intense in the carbon which they emit. So that figure is coming down dramatically, but then so is the figure from the malting barley growers. And this is what I want to talk about now. Which technique are they using? Will they be using regenerative agriculture to build soil organic matter? And there's my definition of it. Usually people try and shoot me down and say, you've no idea what it means. There's the definition, and it's good enough for me. I know that we could talk for hours on that, but let's not. So what we're talking about is one of three things here. In our supply chain, it could be looking at the forestry that you do. It could be restoring peatlands if you're a distiller. But generally, if you're growing malting barley, it's using catch crops or cover crops to try and grab CO2 out of the atmosphere in that time period between harvest and replanting, when the ground otherwise would be left with nothing on it and potentially could actually emit to the atmosphere. It's very effective. Now, I know, because I've been to Illinois and I've given this presentation up there, that they're saying we've tried cover crops and we lost our topsoil many, many years ago, and it's really hard. I get it. This is not an easy answer, but it does work if you get in there early enough. The point is, if you start measuring the carbon cycling on the top of soils, you can be taken down the wrong route, because actually the healthiest soils emit the most carbon if you look in the top 10 centimeters. So actually you're looking at those healthy soils, driving the carbon that they accumulate down into the soil, locking it away so that it can't get out. And when we say locking it away, this little diagram shows you that it's locked away even in places that even the bacteria couldn't get to. And it also means that you can still control your weeds by disking, maybe not subsoiling or deep ploughing, but you can still plough the top 10 centimeters and not destroy this locked away carbon. There are lots of benefits, and you'll see that I love this. I love regenerative agriculture. A 1% increase in organic matter improves drought resistance by 5 to 10 days. It holds the water in your soil. In subsequent years, you need less fertilizer. You don't wash your topsoil away. You improve the structure. You can gain that carbon in weeks, not years, like it takes with some forms of tree planting. It's much lower cost than tree planting. You're not really having much impact on a long-term land use change. And if you're subject to any environmental legislation or people watching what's running off into your ditches, you'll do better with regenerative agriculture. There are some standards around, so this isn't people just making it up and making their own version. There are standards around, and look at those figures up there: 60% reduction in leaching and yields. So this is good stuff. So why then am I not so keen on organic? There was a paper looking at the greenhouse impacts of converting production in England and Wales to organic, and they predicted major shortfalls in production against a conventional baseline if we went to organic. Now, if you're an organic farmer on here, you're not going to like to hear that. But generally, we find that the yield is the biggest problem with organic, not its aims. Its aims are brilliant. You know, to use less synthetic damaging chemicals is great. Who wouldn't? No one's going to argue against that. But the problem is that at the moment is that most organic farmers have a yield penalty, and there's some examples of the yield penalties that there are. You know, this is based on 300 odd papers. I always get someone coming to me saying, look, there's one paper, there's one farm I can point you to. So brilliant, well done. Get that farm to work with these other guys on here, because you cannot take that sort of yield penalty. And it comes from all around the world. I'm just going to give you one example on here. Here's one just from Germany. I've got lots from different parts of the world, but I'm not going to put them on here. In nearly every crop and in nearly every geography, you will find that there is a big difference. So does that mean we forget organic? No. It means that there needs to be a fusion of ideas between the organic and regenerative guys to get the improved emissions and less intense use of chemicals on the ground. It's interesting, though, because the US is showing that this is more valuable than the rest of the world. As far as I know, the US is the only place at the moment that is offering reduced insurance claims if people are putting cover crops in. 24% likely, the insurance companies say, to have losses in fields if you're using cover crops and no-till. Pretty impressive. Even protecting against yield losses, and even better if you use this on the worst farms possible. This isn't news. You should probably have heard about this. This was a piece of information that came from USDA in 2023, but there's other papers, and I've given you a QR code there that go back as far as 2021, saying exactly the same thing. So really, this is an area where we should be looking at to really minimize our impact. Now, interestingly, if you look at what our brewers are doing, they are doing one of two things. So here's an example where Carlsberg have decided they're going to get zero everything. Not bad. but words are easy to say, aren't they? If someone from Carlsberg on, I apologize, but it's not going to stop me saying what I'm saying. So they've said, for example, a zero carbon footprint. Now, what does that actually mean? If you look at that in detail, what they actually mean is that they are going to have a list of different practices on farm, but not necessarily go and measure if those practices are actually delivering. Now, that to me is not zero carbon farming footprint. It is good, but it's maybe not as good as the next slide, which is talking about Heineken. So they decided they want to get real on-farm data. They've been very specific about whether it's scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. They've matched the carbon emissions with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to show that they're really after a broad spectrum impact. And then they've gone and they've actually put their money where their mouth is. 15,000 farms globally. They are measuring a whole range of farm practices, looking at how much not only they reduce their impacts, but also how much they sequester. Now, that to me is the way forward. And they're showing remarkable changes across many parts of the world. So it's not just one part, it's lots of parts. And this is the way we need to go. But it needs to be easy. It doesn't need to be an additional task the farmer does. It needs to be something which is automatic based on the data that he's already collecting. And that's key. Don't make it too difficult. There are lots of claims about regenerative malting around. And again, this is just to say, be careful. I'm not saying these are bad. I'm actually saying they're quite good. But what do you make of all the claims when people say that? So Riverbend Malt House, they said they were the first ever certified regenified malt house. Good for them. I think they've done a good thing. I don't think they've done a bad thing. Don't read that in the wrong way. But who knows about the standard which they've used? So they've used regenified, very cleverly named because it sounds like regenerative. Is it any good? Yes, I think it's okay, but it hasn't got the worldwide claims and something like the Cool Farm tool, 40,000 users. Regenified, I'm not sure, but it's not as many as that. But they are, look at them, they are trying to get real international methods to look in field and to look at the soil. So it's okay. So if you look at something like that, you ask, whose rules are you playing by? And they're okay. It's just that it's, there are lots of these claims about. If you look, though, for example, there's a distiller in the UK called McNean. They've said they're net zero. I don't think they are. They don't like me saying it. Why don't I think they are? Because you have to be very careful when you're looking at the electricity use, because most of the electricity, it will tell you it's 100% renewable. That doesn't mean it's zero carbon. What it generally means is that it's a 0 gram CO2 per kilowatt hour because they bought some carbon credits. Well, if you bought more than 10% carbon credit to balance your electricity supply, you're not net zero, you're carbon neutral. Hence me saying about that. So you need to be very careful. So that's not net zero. And then about certified organic, you've heard me saying about organic there. Yeah, okay, you might be certified organic, but what's your yield? Where's the piece of information on there where your yield is not impacted by 50%? I want to know that when I'm looking at my supply chain. And the problem is if I don't know those two things, then I might be in danger of ignoring those 4 grey boxes, which are absolutely brilliant things that they are doing. And this is the reason for putting this slide up, to help you see that, when you hear these claims, what sort of questions would you ask? But the supply chain that we're looking at, there are big changes that are possible. So to be lean, if you're going to put some, energy efficiency into the process, you maybe will save 10% of your carbon emissions. If you're able to switch your fuel source to, say, wood chip biomass from natural gas, you can save 90%. And is it possible? Yes, I've done it. I moved on from the malting company 4 years ago because I got just about to that point and thought, I think my job's done. I'll go and work for some other companies now. 90%. And then if you get a supply chain which is doing some cover cropping, then you can actually progress to not just even 100%, but being carbon negative and therefore climate positive. So there are lots of things that people are doing now which are having a major impact. So what are my take-home messages from this? I realize it's been a little bit of a whistle stop, and it sometimes feels like I'm on a soapbox, but I'm passionate about the fact that you can do real things. So this drive to attain net zero, it's accelerating. You need to understand the terminology behind scopes 1 to 3, what they mean. It's not going away. And even if you've got uncertain data, like things like spend-based data, to me, it shouldn't stop you trying to make a target in a project, because I find that spend-based data is about 80% certain, so it's a maximum of 20% uncertain. It's usually a little bit on the high side compared to when you measure it for real. But hey, 80-20 is good enough in the rest of our businesses. Why should it be any different for carbon footprinting? Remember that this, again, is you're going to have to report this as the legislation. The pressure is mounting now for us to report this genuine data. But there is technology available in our supply chain to make massive differences already without having to resort to going to buy carbon credits. The key thing for our supply chain, the biggest change at the moment, is going to be probably the growing of barley, which is the biggest chunk of our carbon footprint. But already using cover crops, min-till and regenerative agriculture, some farmers are already delivering carbon negative cereals. We want the rest of them to get on board and do the same thing. So leaving it for you there, I would say that it's fact or fiction. I think it's fact. I think it's a reality. And I think that there's no reason for anybody in the supply chain coming to you and saying, this is all too difficult, there's nothing we can do, it's doom and gloom. It's not. Share this story with as many people as you possibly can. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nigel. Nice to hear that sustainable malt is a possibility, and certainly something I think a lot of people are on the quest for. So that gives us some hope. And definitely we'll have him stick around to do some QA at the end. But I think we'll now go ahead and turn it over to Nathan. And Gina, you want to go ahead and introduce him?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ashley. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Nathan Pelletier. He's an associate professor at the University of British Columbia-Okanagan, where he is jointly appointed to the Faculty of Science and Management. Nathan holds the Egg Farmers of Canada Industrial Research Chair in Sustainability, and he's also the director of the Bachelor of Sustainability program at UBCO. We're also really pleased to have Nathan and Dr. Yishu Lee working on a project that they're just getting started up here in Canada, and we look forward to your presentation. So I'll hand it over to you now. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Gina. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah. All good.
Great. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Very pleased to be here. And yeah, I think you'll find what I have to say quite complimentary to what was just presented. So I work at UBC, where I have the privilege of working with a big team of very clever grad students and postdocs who do all of the heavy lifting. Our lab really focuses on what's called life cycle-based sustainability measurement and management in the context of industrial agri-food supply chains. Now, as Gina mentioned, I'm currently collaborating with researchers from the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Centre, as well as the Canadian Grains Commission and Bort Malt, on a project that's funded by the National Barley Cluster. And our aim is, among other things, to benchmark and to identify strategies to improve sustainability outcomes in Canadian barley production and malting. So I'm going to begin first by reviewing some of the reasons why this kind of sustainability measurement and management has really become a focal area in the agri-food sector. I'll next describe in broad strokes the current state of art with respect to how we go about measuring and managing for sustainability, and introduce some of what my lab at UBC does to operationalize these approaches across a variety of food sectors. And then I'll talk about our current initiative in collaboration with our partners to develop life cycle assessment as well as optimization models of Canadian malt barley production and malting practices, which we are just getting underway this fall. So to begin, why should we care about sustainability? And really, why are stakeholders within the agri-food sector suddenly paying so much attention to figuring out, well, how can we meaningfully measure, manage for, and communicate with our value chain partners and with consumers with respect to sustainability? I think the first obvious reason is that really, if you're not tuning in, you're finding yourself in increasingly lonely company, because sustainability really has moved to the center of the global development agenda. We see this, of course, reflected in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which lay out priorities for the development agenda internationally. And it's now really widely recognized that food and agriculture are actually at the center of most of our sustainable development goals. The second reason is that sustainability is increasingly becoming a basis for competition in the marketplace. And this comes along with increasing scrutiny and pressure to actually demonstrate on the basis of rigorous and transparent analyses the potential benefits or disbenefits of producing and consuming different food and agriculture products in different ways. Now, another reason why this is increasingly salient for what I call traditional agriculture is with respect to competing with next generation food production technologies. Now, I was at an event that was hosted by Buehler in Switzerland a couple of summers ago, and it was a big event. It was attended by CEOs and managers from companies that probably represented about 50% of the calories that are traded internationally. The event included a trade show featuring innovative agri-food companies. And I guess that probably 3/4 of the booths in that trade show hosted cellular agriculture startups. It was clearly very early days for this industry. There's going to be a whole lot of losers alongside a few companies that will win big. But this is a future that is coming, and it will probably be an important determinant of how traditional crop and livestock sectors fare when competing on the basis of sustainability attributes. There will be an increasing onus to demonstrate that traditional ag can compete. Now, all of this is increasingly salient in the context of our mutual ambitions to reduce climate impacts. Now, according to some, under current practices in the agri-food sector, and based on projected growth, even if we were able to eliminate all fossil fuel emissions elsewhere in the economy immediately, emissions coming from food systems globally alone would make it impossible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, that's pretty sobering. We're collectively in a race to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century, and the food sector has an absolutely critical role to play in this context. So for this reason, we see leading companies and industry organizations all across the food sector stepping up and making public commitments to drastically cut emissions. But of course, for the sake of credibility and effectiveness, any such initiatives will need to be supported by rigorous sustainability measurement and management science. Now, all of this is certainly important as a matter of principle, right? As a matter of social responsibility, potentially increasingly as a matter of maintaining social license to operate. But it's also really an opportunity for those companies and for those sectors who really are prepared to step up. Because I certainly believe that the food systems of the future will be populated in no small part by the winners in the sustainability space. So if we are on the same page with respect to the general importance of sustainability, the next obvious question is, well, how do we actually go about measuring and managing for sustainability in a way that's both credible and effective? Now, in reality, this is a pretty complex objective. It's complicated first because producing the majority of calories in our food system, whether it comes from small or large scale farms, or whether it's purchased at the farm gate or the supermarket, it's almost always predicated on pretty complicated supply chain networks that are providing inputs like fuels, fertilizers, and crop protection products, as well as activities related to processing and packaging and transporting food and agriculture commodities. It's also complicated because sustainability itself is really a multifaceted objective, right? We have to be able to measure and manage across a whole suite of indicators for our diverse sustainability objectives. We have to be able to prioritize among them, and also to reconcile the trade-offs that we're almost always going to confront when we choose among alternatives. So in light of, and to help us more systematically grapple with this complexity and to actually arrive at meaningful evidence-based decision support, a concept called life cycle thinking really has become a cornerstone of contemporary sustainability measurement and management science. Life cycle thinking is simply predicated on the recognition that to be effective in making choices that are consistent with our sustainability objectives, we need to measure and manage for sustainability, both at a systems or a supply chain level, as well as on a multi-criteria basis. Because the very real danger of doing otherwise, right, if we fail to think and act at a systems level and on a multi-criteria basis, is that we very much run the risk of creating unanticipated trade-offs and potentially of even undermining our capacity to achieve the very objectives that we're pursuing. You can imagine, as an example, a farmer who is taking efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but focusing at the farm level only, and as a result, makes choices that actually increase net emissions along the value chain as a whole, or that perhaps creates trade-offs with respect to land use efficiency or even worker conditions or other important objectives. So how do we accommodate this kind of complexity in practice? Operationalizing life cycle thinking is now made possible by a whole variety of international consensus-based methods that have been developed precisely for the purpose of allowing us to be very structured and systematic in our sustainability measurement and management efforts. Now, most of these methods build directly on the ISO 1444 standard. This is the international reference norm for a modeling framework called environmental life cycle assessment, and it really represents the gold standard for sustainability accounting. What environmental life cycle assessment provides is a framework for very systematically developing and reporting a detailed accounting of all of those material and energy resource flows that are mobilized to support different activities along supply chains, to track emissions related to those activities, and then to subsequently quantify how all of those flows and emissions contribute to a range of potential resource or environmental impacts. So this kind of empirical data then provides us with a really critical information layer in support of evidence-based sustainability decision-making. And of course, for any of these kind of methods to be practically useful, having access to really high quality data to characterize those activities and impacts along the value chain is absolutely essential. Indeed, modelers like myself spend a huge amount of our time working with different supply chain actors in order to obtain good quality data. Now, fortunately, this effort is becoming easier over time, simply because the value proposition of being able to measure, manage, and communicate with respect to sustainability objectives is becoming increasingly clear. So if we do use tools like LCA, and provided we populate them with really good quality data, what kind of information can they provide and what kind of decisions can they ultimately support? Well, first, they're very useful for benchmarking and for understanding key drivers of sustainability impacts along value chains, which of course is really important if we want to target our interventions where they're going to be most effective. It also allows us to make rigorous comparisons between different products or different technologies, to design our production systems or reconfigure them, taking into account different sustainability objectives, and very importantly, to make sure that we're operating on the basis of evidence rather than on unsubstantiated assumptions. So all of the work that my lab at UBC, along with our spin-off Prism Consulting, does to advance sustainability measurement in the agri-food sector is based on life cycle thinking and assessment. Our activities are organized around three core themes. First, we're very active in the data resource development space. So this includes launching and beginning to populate the Canadian Agri-Food Lifecycle Data Centre, which is a publicly available repository of data sets to use in LCA studies to model agri-food sector activities. Second, we work with a variety of companies, industry associations, and government bodies to develop very detailed baseline life cycle assessment models to benchmark the sustainability impacts of products from different sectors, as well as to evaluate potential green technology or management solutions that might be adopted to improve different sustainability outcomes. And finally, we develop sustainability decision support tools in order to put this kind of life cycle based data directly into the hands of decision makers. So in this context, we're very pleased to be collaborating with researchers at the CMBTC and the Canadian Grains Commission, as well as Bork Malt, to develop benchmarks for and to identify opportunities to optimize both barley production and malting systems in Canada for life cycle based sustainability objectives. So the aspects of this project that will be led in my lab are two-part. So the first is to develop detailed regionalized models of malt barley production on the Canadian prairies. So here we will adopt what's called a cradle to farm gate system boundary. What this means is that our models would be constructed using data, the production of the inputs that are utilized on farm, so things like fertilizers, fuels, and plant protection products. We'll also collect farm level data with respect to actual input amounts and activity patterns. And we'll use a variety of models where measurements aren't available to account for things like nitrogen fluxes and soil organic carbon fluxes. Now, to ensure that our models are actually representative, we'll be putting a lot of effort into collecting detailed data sets from malt barley farmers. The data will be collected using an online survey beginning early this winter that will be pilot tested and refined by industry collaborators prior to launch. And here it's going to be really important to work closely with industry partners and associations, both to promote the survey as well as to incentivize farmers to complete it in order to ensure that we arrive at a really representative sample of production practices in the sector. Now, with respect to spatial resolution, we're going to develop models beginning at the ecozone scale. So ecozones are regions defined based on soil and climatic factors. And both of these are really important determinants of characteristic management practices, as well as field level emissions and field crop production. We'll then aggregate these models up to both provincial and prairie province average models. So in the end, what kind of information will this modeling provide us with? Well, first, it's going to enable us to determine current Canadian industry average environmental performance for malt barley production, as well as the variability we see between individual farms and the sources of that variability. So this kind of information is very useful in supporting industry-level initiatives that are aimed at improving sustainability outcomes in the sector over time. It's also very useful when customers who are sourcing Canadian barley ask for this kind of information for use in their own sustainability initiatives. These models will also help us to understand both the key drivers of environmental performance in malt barley production, as well as any differences in drivers and outcomes between barley producing regions and practices. So here, for example, we see some results presented for field peas that are produced in different ecozones and provinces. This was part of an analysis that my lab completed for Pulse Canada. And as you can see in this figure, there are actually quite large differences in the carbon footprint of field peas, depending on where they are produced. Now, overall, we found the ecozone level of aggregation is actually the best predictor of emissions levels as opposed to provincial boundaries. And this makes sense, right? Given the strong influence of climate and soil on things like pest pressures, characteristic management practices, as well as field scale emissions. It's also going to be very important that we do a good job modeling soil organic carbon fluxes in barley production. Now, Western Canadian field crops tend to have a distinct advantage over similar crops produced in many other jurisdictions due to that historical conversion to conservation or no-till agriculture, because this has really enabled rebuilding soil organic carbon stocks over time. So in this figure here, for example, you can see that the soil organic carbon storage in pea and lentil production in Western Canadian provinces is actually currently more than sufficient to offset greenhouse gas emissions from other sources, such as fertilizer production and application and burning fuel and farm machinery. Another very useful related application of this kind of modeling is in scrutinizing and generating data with respect to claims, for example, regarding regenerative agriculture. Now, there's certainly a lot of buzz with respect to regenerative agriculture at present, which is generally defined as practices focused on building soil carbon and supporting increases in biodiversity. But life cycle modeling can really help us understand what the potential benefits or impacts of specific regenerative agricultural practices are. Beyond these more obvious applications, these kind of models can help us understand how environmental performance in the sector has and may continue to change over time. Environmental efficiency in agriculture is very much a moving target, but that target moves at different rates and with different implications depending on the product, the sector, and the context. This is because we see changes both at farm level and along the supply chains that support agricultural production, but they evolve at different rates. So in the freight transport sector, for example, which connects most supply chain activities, efficiencies in Canada have improved across transport modes over the past 50 years, ranging from around a 20% improvement in truck transport to over 110% improvement for rail and ship transport. Even more important have been efficiency improvements in fertilizer production, in particular ammonia synthesis. This is one of the most energy-intensive aspects of modern agriculture, but energy efficiencies in modern ammonia synthesis plants have doubled since the 1960s in Canada. So when we look at corn production, for example, where we see yields in our major corn-producing regions have doubled since the 1960s, while energy and nitrogen inputs per ton of crop produced have declined by about 20 and 44% respectively, all of these together add up to substantial reductions in the overall life cycle impacts of producing that crop over time. Now, similarly, looking forward, we can anticipate that resource and environmental impacts will continue to change, right? In some contexts, we'll actually see increased impacts driven by yield losses associated with climate change. And in others, we'll see continued gains through things like genetic developments or adoption of new technologies. I think in particular, developments and uptake of precision ag technologies like variable rate fertilization, along with electrification and the development of green ammonia sources, will likely represent real wins for the barley sector with respect to improving sustainability outcomes. But it's going to be really important to assess these using rigorous life cycle-based modeling in order to ensure that we're actually achieving net positive outcomes and to manage any potential trade-offs. Now, finally, I suspect that various stakeholders may be interested in our research outcomes as a basis for comparing Canadian malt barley to products from other regions. So in this slide, we see results from some work that my team completed for the Global Institute for Food Security in the Government of Saskatchewan to compare the carbon footprints of exported Canadian field crops to those same crops produced in competitor countries. So what the numbers on the right of this figure tell us is how many times crops produced in Saskatchewan could be transported to markets in Germany before the combined emissions from production and transportation would be equal to the production-related emissions alone of those same crops produced in Germany. In other words, for all three of these crops exported to Germany, emissions related to transportation are far outweighed by the much lower emissions of producing those crops in Saskatchewan. Now, alongside and in complement to our assessment of malt barley production, our project will also be conducting similar analyses of barley malting practices here in Canada. The objectives here are, by working closely with malt producers and malt research centers, to build up really detailed models of the malting process that we can use for life cycle assessment, techno-economic assessment, process simulation, and optimization of malt production for both environmental and economic objectives. Now, we're still very much at the beginning of our project, so it's going to be some time before we have concrete results to share with you, but I do look forward to working with some or perhaps many of you to move this project forward so as to really maximize its potential utility for your sector.
Awesome. That was excellent, Nathan. And I know we're going to be excited to have you back when you have results to share with us. And hopefully we can do some of the same work down in the US. So thank you very much. So that wraps up our formal presentations. And Nathan, if you want to go ahead and stop your share, we'll go ahead and let people turn their camera on if they want, and go ahead and ask questions of either of our presenters. And if you don't want to come off mute, you're welcome. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box as well. But with that, let's go ahead and get started.
I'm going to try to find the part of my screen where I can turn my share off here.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh, there we go.
Got it?
Hidden in too many tiles and windows.
There we go. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and get us started just because people are being shy. I have a question for Nigel. You briefly mentioned fertilizer products that are becoming, say, more green. What are some of the products in the UK or in Europe that you're seeing that people are getting excited about that are going to help to contribute to lowering greenhouse gas emissions? I recognize that there's regulation and probably policies in place that are maybe making that adoption speed up a little bit in the UK and even in Canada. And I think we're seeing a little bit slower adoption here in the US. So just maybe share some thoughts on what some of those products may be.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what Nathan mentioned as well, that the emissions are coming down. So they used to make it effectively starting with nitric acid, and the way they made nitric acid, especially with fossil fuels, was pretty poor. And making a long story short, they stopped doing that many years back, reduced the emissions by 40% by stopping the stuff going up the chimney. Then they said, why do we make nitric acid? Let's make ammonia instead, and let's make it with green electricity. So that's a very long, that's a long story, but cutting that short, then they're not quite ready to tell us how much that's going to reduce it by, but some figure, it's going to be a very, very big number. So that contribution of nitrogen in the production side is coming down. So companies like Yara, for example, they're not the only ones. BASF have got some. So, and you're seeing the maltsters now sort of ally themselves with companies that are doing this. So I think in the UK, Simpsons have gone with BASF. There's some very big companies have gone with Yara. The problem at the moment is that there isn't enough of it to go around, but it will be coming soon. And what really focused people's minds, of course, was when the gas was a problem in Europe and with the Ukraine war, suddenly everyone said, why the heck were we not doing this research years ago? Well, that's a very good question, too late to ask it, but there's some very good stuff coming in the supply chain. So it's those sorts of products. There's also quite a lot of companies now coming and looking at repurposed food waste. Not as good, I would say, not as good carbon footprint wise, but at least people are now looking for these potential ones. Of course, the question is, yeah, you can make it, but how good is it when you actually put it on the malting barley? Does it have anything bad? Any bad impacts? And generally I've found, no, it doesn't. It doesn't raise proteins like everyone says it's going to do. It doesn't do all these things. But then does it do anything that's good as well as reducing the emissions? A lot of interest in this.
Great, thank you. Hiroshi, you have your hand raised?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. So I have a question to Nigel. And first of all, thank you very much for the great presentation, and I enjoyed it. And I'm a research scientist in Western Canada. And for you, I've got a question about the sustainability of malting barley production and the carbon footprint, and especially like considering geographical differences. And as I said, I'm from Western Canada, and our farming practices are quite different from those in Europe or some other countries. And for last 30 years or so, Western Canadian farmers have been using no-till systems, and that's resulting in some rate increase in soil organic carbon, as Nathan mentioned. Like in more than like 1,000 kg, like a cumulative soil organic carbon increased in last 30 years. And our use of agricultural input is also lower compared to some other major malting barley production countries. So I see that it's a kind of positive journey for Western Canadian malting barley producers. And here's kind of my question. And so with all this in mind, I'm curious about your thought on how Canadian farmers and the malting industry can keep up with what we have been doing, and also to promote a sustainable production system like a globally, because we have been improving our cropping system. So like as a research scientist, I'm thinking, okay, improving like a carbon footprint and so on. There is a small margin. So I'm just curious about your thought about like.
I mean, I think it's a great story, Hiroshi. I think it's an absolutely great story. I think it's a shame that one of the biggest problems, I think, is that you've got a good story to tell in Canada there. There are lots of good stories to tell, but if you look in the farming community, there is still globally quite a difference between the way that farmers want to talk about that or believe it. So I've done some work, for example, with farmers in the Netherlands, over in Europe. They love sharing this information and they want to help each other. We tried to do the same thing in Poland and the UK, and the farmers were, we're not giving you our data. We're not talking to you. It's ours. And it's very hard sometimes to get over those sort of cultural differences. there's also quite a backlash in the farming community as to who's going to pay this. And I noticed on Nathan's slide, there was something about incentivizing farmers. My eyes lit up when I saw that, because it's, to me, the incentive is doesn't necessarily mean a premium to pay for the sort of things you were talking about. It can be, as you say, in the reduction that farmers see in their fertilizer in subsequent years, but not enough of them believe this. So telling your story about how your farmers have achieved this is very, very important. And there's not enough of that mentioned in the supply chain at the moment. So, you can look at conversion factors. You can get a 20% difference depending on where you buy your fertilizer from, at least at the moment. If you look at the carbon footprint of malting barley around the world, I would say that of the ones I believe, the carbon footprint is anywhere between minus 30 kilograms per ton of malting barley, and that includes some sequestration, to somewhere around about 400 kilograms of CO2 per ton. There's a huge difference. But getting it down to those low levels is vitally important in what Nathan was talking about, because you can, when people say you shouldn't ship it around the world, you say, look, forget the transport, that's rubbish, that's nothing. Look at what we're doing in terms of the production. And you can win your arguments and sell your products abroad, because I've done it, enabling people to see that. And I love Nathan's slide there. I might have to pinch that if he allows me, of how many times you could send your material across to Germany to and use the good farming practice to show that you were more than compensating by your farming practices. But it's the story. So I would say tell that story loud and clear, that these farming practices work. Not enough people believe it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. I've got a question that came in for Nathan. This is from Carlos. What's your perspective to the results of different LCA analyses? Do you foresee the need for harmonization? And maybe speak a little bit to the importance of the input data.
Sure. Yeah. Harmonization is always important when you want to be able to make comparisons. We have, widely accepted standard methods, but there are still choices within those methods that are up to a practitioner to make that can be quite influential in determining, what something like a carbon footprint comes out to be. Typically, when I make comparisons, I prefer to do it on a methodologically consistent basis. So, for example, when I showed you that slide, with the carbon footprint of Canadian crops compared to crops produced in other jurisdictions, we actually use the same methods to evaluate the carbon footprint of those crops produced in other jurisdictions. I wouldn't feel comfortable simply going to the literature and say, oh, somebody over here reported this value. That's a good basis for comparison, because those methodological differences could be confounding. So there's the methodological consistency that matters, and just as important is the data quality piece. A lot of what we see floating around in the public domain, especially a lot of stuff that's coming out of private sector consulting at present, is utilizing proxy data from other places, and that's good kind of at a screening level if we want to understand in broad strokes how one product category compares to another. But if you really want to start making rigorous comparisons, say in the marketplace, or if you want to drive improvements along a given supply chain, you really have to use high quality context specific data to support that.
Great. Thank you. And I do recognize we're at the top of the hour. Probably many of you are needing to drop off, but I think that our speakers might have a little bit of time to just take a couple more questions. But if you are having to drop off, I do just want to thank you very much for attending today, and hope you can join us during our next session. So with that, Brian, I believe your hand was up next.
Okay. I guess I have to be old and buggery and negative on this, but the fact of the matter is you guys are forgetting about water, which is the other key factor in this. And the vast majority of areas in North America that are good malting barley producing areas do not get enough average precipitation in a year to grow a decent barley crop. So this whole regenerative agriculture thing is just simply not on. Occasionally, we get some areas in the eastern parts of the prairies and the eastern parts of the U.S. prairies where they don't grow any barley anymore, where you might be able to actually use that kind of system. Remember that when people in Europe talk about drought, they're very often talking about 3 to 4 times our annual average precipitation. And we also have something called winter. And, this whole thing has to be kept in perspective, and don't forget about the water. And Nathan, I was really pleased to hear you talk about calories, because so much of the food system is always telling me about eating vegetables and what have you. And all Health Canada has done is put half of my plate to be water, because all those veggies are 98% water. What we really need in the world are calories from carbohydrates, fats, and obviously we need protein to be able to make use of those. This is all about energy. And you're talking about carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and we don't make those. We shuffle them around. And whenever we shuffle them around, it takes what? It takes energy, whether that's to feed my belly or a cow or someone in Bangladesh or wherever it is. You really need to keep these things in perspective, and particularly for Western Canada and most of the barley production areas of the US, water. Best barley production areas in the US right now are all irrigated. And maybe that's not going to be possible in the future. So keep that in mind, please.
In Nigel and Nathan's defense, we did not ask him to talk about water, so I will say that. But
That's fine.
Nathan, did you want to say anything?
Brian raises some very good points. I mean, interestingly, the reason why we saw that historical transition to conservation tillage and no-till in Western Canada was largely because of soil moisture constraints, right? And it had the knock-on benefit of allowing us to rebuild soil organic carbon. Absolutely not all practices can be applied everywhere. There are going to be context-specific constraints. We already widely practice crop rotations in Western Canada, right? So we know that including pulses in a rotation, for example, is a good way to reduce your carbon footprint because you have that added nitrogen sequestration benefit as well. Not all the cover crops that are going to be used in one region could be used in another, right? We always have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Will we be more constrained by water in Western Canada in the future? Probably. I mean, it looks like we are increasingly drying out, so that may place very real constraints on regions where irrigation is impossible, as well as on available irrigation water. Interestingly, though, you talk about Canada being very different, and those differences are actually in many ways advantageous, right? We've got the luxury of space, so huge and get real economies of scale in production. We can't get the same yields, but we do get product using a lower input ratio. And because of that very cold winter where we can't grow anything, we actually have really low soil nitrous oxide emissions compared to other regions like Europe. So these things will remain beneficial for Canadian crop production farmers in a comparative context looking forward.
Yeah, I think if I would agree with all of that. Of course, I would. And I think the issue I've said constantly over many years that I feel that we know what the answer is just to carbon emissions, and we just need to kick up the backside to get on and sort it out. But water, we don't know the answer to, and people have talked about that's what we're likely to be fighting wars about in the future. I don't want people fighting wars, but it is important now. Ironically, had the regenerative agriculture practice has been more in place in those areas, and had they kept the soil organic matter, and then places like Illinois hadn't lost all of the topsoil, we wouldn't be having this discussion, because it would be holding onto its water. So more organic content holds onto the water. I've seen countless trials where just due to water availability, you can have a 12-15% swing in yield if you've got a soil which is high in organic matter and holds onto its water. So I would agree. I think it is about water. Interestingly, though, the reason I think that regenerative agriculture has still got a place is that Brian's comment on nutrition is absolutely right. Since about 1945, the crops we produce and the fruit we produce is at least 40% less intense in its nutrients. We have over-farmed and we're delivering much less nutrition for the same yield, and we need to reverse that, and we can do it. And I think it won't work everywhere, but that the World Resources Institute have come out and they've been quite negative in a way, but correctly saying regen ag is not the answer to the world's problems. It's not, but it's the answer to some of the world's problems.
Thank you. Jake, we've got your hand up.
Yes. I think I'm here on the screen.
Yep, I hear you. See ya.
So I farm here in Idaho, and speaking of water, I have pivots, and I also have flood ground, and I run depending on the year, a few thousand acres of barley. And we've explored the option of putting solar panels on our pivots in the corners that don't get watered very well. And frankly, it doesn't pencil. And the concern that every one of these farmers have, I'm 40 years old, is how in the world do we take over our family farms when land prices are so expensive? And I guess my question to you, or my concern would be, if the UN, if the world is interested in trying to have farmers be carbon neutral, to do minimal tillage, no tillage, those sort of things, is there any sort of funding that can happen from the UN? Is there any sort of funding that can happen from the states? This next year, the University of Idaho has a program with the USDA, and we're taking advantage of that. But frankly, it's not enough. And that's my question. I love the idea of being carbon neutral or carbon negative as a farmer. But all my friends, all the farmers that I know, especially in the barley, it doesn't pencil. That's just the reality. Is there a movement from the UN in order to help us farmers do all the right things that you're discussing that frankly we want to do? Anyway, I guess that's my question.
Ashley, shall I take that one? Because I mean, in the UK, I don't know if you know the body. There's a body that represents farmers or promotes farmers called the Red Tractor Organisation. I'm on the crops board of that, and there is at times celebration and despair amongst farmer members, because they don't actually believe that anyone's going to pay them for the good that they're doing, and I understand that argument. Although, for example, in the UK, there are, I'm not sure about the UN, but in the UK, there are subsidies around for farmers. I don't believe that's where this is going to come from. I believe it's going to come from the supply chain. And I believe the supply chain is waking up to the idea that it will have to pay some sort of premium. They've gone in the other direction for many years, saying, we're not going to pay more for this. This is just the right thing to do. That doesn't wash with farmers. Farmers, as you say, they're taking over farms which have potentially not been farmed in the best way or over farmed for many years. So, if you look at a lot of the brewers and distillers are looking down their supply chain, they're realizing Scope 3 is a big number. They've got to get to net zero. How are they going to do it? Are they going to buy carbon credits? No, that's fraught with danger. And if those that have bought carbon in planting trees in Australia, they've seen those go. In California, they've seen them go. That's not the way to do it. You're much better not to be buying any carbon credits, but incentivizing your supply chain, paying them to deliver you low carbon barley. That becomes a contractual arrangement. It's money in the farmer's pocket for that year. And if he can't deliver the following year, he doesn't get the premium. But it's a real number. Every year, it's a real number, and it's a way of incentivizing farmers. That, to me, is the way to go. And it's not by buying carbon credits. And I think it's more likely to have a commercial chance of success than it is than relying on government subsidies, which I just don't think are going to be widespread enough to move this at scale. That's my view.
Thanks for that, Nigel. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, I just wanted to put up a teaser for next month then as we wrap up here. Again, thanks if you've stuck it out with us. Thanks for joining us today. Really want to thank both Nigel and Nathan for their wonderful presentations. And as I mentioned at the top, we will have this recorded and shared out to everyone. But really do hope that you'll join us next month. I know this month we were talking kind of very high level about some of these issues that we are attempting to tackle in the industry. And next month it's going to be a bit more applicable, kind of digging into some of these pieces and trying to figure out what that means for our supply chain. So Gina, do you have anything before we conclude today?
No, I think I just want to thank the presenters for their excellent presentations and a great start to our seminar series. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and hopefully that just got the conversation started. And certainly if anybody wants to be able to reach out to Nigel or Nathan directly and you don't have their information, I can get that to you. So feel free to reach out to Gina or I, all right?
Thanks for the excellent presentation and a very interesting discussion. Looking forward for next seminar.
Great. Thank you so much, Yushu. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.